The USS Nautilus was the world's first operational nuclear-powered submarine, a technological triumph of the early Cold War era. Authorized by Congress in 1951, just 4 years later, on January 17, 1955, under Commander Eugene P. Dennis Wilkinson, Nautilus cast off her lines and sent the historic message, "Underway on nuclear power." Powered by an onboard nuclear reactor, Nautilus could remain submerged far longer and travel faster underwater than any diesel-electric sub before her. This breakthrough fulfilled a long-held vision of a true submarine, a vessel that could operate continuously beneath the waves, free from the need to surface frequently. The development of Nautilus required visionary leadership, new technology, and solutions to unprecedented engineering challenges. This video provides a structured overview of how Admiral Hyman G. Rickover and his team turned the nuclear submarine from concept into reality, covering the historical context, strategic motivations, key technical decisions, and the roles of major figures and contractors, including a young Lieutenant Jimmy Carter. World War II had demonstrated the tremendous impact of submarines in naval warfare, but also highlighted the limitations of the diesel-electric submarines of the era. Conventional subs had to surface or snorkel regularly to recharge batteries, limiting their stealth and endurance. Underwater speed was also very limited. For example, the U.S. Navy's most advanced late 1940s diesel subs, the Tang class, could make about 17 knots submerged for only about an hour before exhausting battery power. A 1946 report by Naval Research Laboratory scientist Ross Gunn and physicist Philip Abelson suggested that an atomic-powered submarine could achieve 26 to 30 knots submerged and operate for years without refueling. Early in the Cold War, both the U.S. and other nations recognized that a submarine with a new power source would confer a massive strategic advantage. The U.S. Navy explored various alternatives, including closed-cycle engines and high-test peroxide system, but these offered only incremental improvements in underwater performance. Abelson even speculated that within a decade, radically redesigned nuclear subs might reach 40 to 60 knots undersea, far beyond any diesel sub's capability. Such performance would render obsolete the anti-submarine tactics of World War II, which assumed submarines must surface often. The strategic motivations for a nuclear submarine program were therefore clear: to create a truly stealthy, long-range undersea vessel that could outrun and outlast any conventional submarine. This was not only crucial for anti-shipping or attack roles, but it also laid the groundwork for future missions like polar under-ice transit and, eventually, nuclear deterrence with submarine-launched missiles. By the late 1940s, the United States had a strong lead in nuclear technology from the Manhattan Project, and visionary thinkers in both the scientific community and the Navy pushed to leverage that lead for naval propulsion. In 1946, as the U.S. established the Atomic Energy Commission, abbreviated as AAC, to oversee nuclear research, the Navy assigned a small group of officers to learn about reactor technology at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Among them was Captain Hyman G. Rickover, a former submarine officer and engineering specialist who would become the driving force behind Nautilus. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, who was a captain in the late 1940s, is often called the father of the nuclear navy, and for good reason. Rickover's personal vision, relentless drive, and deft navigation of bureaucracy were pivotal in launching the nuclear propulsion program. In mid-1946, Rickover was sent to Oak Ridge as part of a Navy contingent working on an experimental reactor project. There, he became convinced that nuclear-powered ships, especially submarines, were not only feasible but essential to the Navy's future. His immediate supervisors were skeptical of the idea, initially reassigning him to other duties, but Rickover bypassed the chain of command and took his case directly to the Chief of Naval Operations, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz, himself a former submariner, supported the concept. Backed by Nimitz and Secretary of the Navy Dan Kimball, the Navy in 1948 to 49 created a dedicated nuclear power branch within the Bureau of Ships, sometime referred to as BU-Ships, and installed Rickover as its head. Simultaneously, the AEC appointed Rickover as director of its new Naval Reactors branch in its Reactor Development Division. By 1949, Rickover wore two hats, one as a Navy captain in charge of nuclear propulsion in BU-Ships, and one as an AEC official overseeing naval reactor development. This dual authority was unprecedented, but proved crucial. It allowed Rickover to coordinate and control both the military requirements and the nuclear engineering aspects of the project, cutting through interagency red tape. Rickover proved to be an extraordinary leader of this program. He insisted on total responsibility and accountability, famously micromanaging everything from high-level design reviews down to the selection of personnel and contractors. In the words of a 1952 Navy Award citation, Captain Rickover, more than any other individual, is responsible for the rapid development of the nuclear ship program. His efforts have led to the laying of the keel of the world's first nuclear-powered ship well in advance of its original schedule. That first keel of Nautilus was laid in June 1952, just a few years after the program began, reflecting Rickover's unceasing drive and energy, as noted in the same citation. Part of Rickover's leadership strategy was to secure the best talent and hold them to exacting standards. He personally interviewed every officer candidate for the nuclear fleet, establishing a rigorous vetting process that became legend in the Navy. Under Rickover's direction, the Navy and AEC worked in tandem to turn nuclear propulsion from theory into practice. He leveraged high-level support to obtain funding and priority. In July 1951, Congress formally authorized the construction of a nuclear-powered submarine, then known only as Project K, or the Atomic-Powered Submarine. Rickover also ensured that the project had the freedom to depart from Navy norms when necessary. For example, instead of assigning construction to a Navy shipyard under traditional bureaucracy, Rickover opted to use a private contractor, Electric Boat Company, because it could more readily accept direct oversight from his Naval Reactors Group and operate with flexibility. Throughout the project, Rickover's insistence on safety, reliability, and technical rigor set the tone. He demanded exhaustive testing of components, quality control in manufacturing, and thorough training for the crew. The fact that the U.S. Navy has never had a nuclear reactor accident is often attributed to the culture of excellence and strict standards Rickover instilled from the beginning. At the heart of Nautilus was a revolutionary power plant, a tiny nuclear reactor capable of propelling a submarine. In the late 1940s, no reactor in the world had ever been used to drive a ship, so choosing the right reactor design was a critical decision. Early on, the Naval Reactors team considered 3 different reactor concepts that might meet the Navy's needs. First was a gas-cooled reactor. This design, inspired by the wartime Daniels Pile project, would use a gas, like helium, to transfer heat from the reactor to steam generators. While feasible in principle, gas is a poor coolant in terms of heat capacity. Analyses showed a gas-cooled reactor would need to be relatively large, with bulky heat exchangers, to produce the required power. Given the materials available in the 1940s, a compact high-performance gas reactor was out of reach. The size and space requirements simply wouldn't fit in a submarine hull. This concept was set aside as impractical for the first-generation submarine. Second, a liquid metal-cooled reactor, LMR. A more promising option was to use a liquid metal, such as molten sodium or a sodium-potassium alloy, as the coolant. Liquid metal conducts heat extremely well, allowing for a very high power density. A smaller reactor could produce more power. The liquid metal design the Navy examined was an intermediate spectrum reactor, neutrons at energies between fast and thermal, that could even breed fuel, an idea pursued by scientists at General Electric's Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory. The LMR offered advantages: higher temperature output for efficient turbines and a compact core moderated only slightly, yielding more neutrons per fission. However, the drawbacks were formidable. Sodium is highly reactive. Any leak or contact with air or water can cause fires or explosions, so the entire system must be absolutely leak-proof. The metallurgy was uncertain. Piping, pumps, and valves all would face corrosion and sealing challenges with hot liquid sodium. Every piece of equipment in an LMR plant, pumps, heat exchangers, instrumentation, would essentially need to be invented from scratch to handle sodium's properties. Because of these unknowns, the liquid metal reactor was recognized as high risk. Rickover and the AEC viewed it as a backup in case the primary approach ran into trouble. They did initiate an LMR project a bit later. This became the reactor for the second nuclear sub, USS Seawolf, but it was the fallback option rather than the main plan. The third option, shortened as PWR, was a light water-cooled and moderated reactor, the design that ultimately powered Nautilus. In a PWR, ordinary water serves as both coolant and neutron moderator. Water had several points in its favor. It provided a nice thermal neutron spectrum, good for efficiency with enriched uranium fuel, and decent heat transfer capacity, so a water-cooled core could be made compact. If the reactor used very highly enriched uranium, the core could be physically small while still producing significant power. A high-pressure primary circuit would be needed to prevent the water from boiling, keeping it liquid up to high temperatures. This meant the steam produced for the turbines would be lower pressure and lower temperature than in a conventional fossil fuel plant, which in turn meant slightly lower thermal efficiency and the need for specially designed turbines. But crucially, the PWR's challenges, high-pressure vessel, pumps, seals, and heat exchangers, were engineering problems that could be tackled with known technology and materials given sufficient development. Water is chemically benign in a marine environment. Leaks would just be water, not combustible sodium. And unlike the exotic coolant systems needed for an LMR, a pressurized water system could draw on decades of experience in boilers, pumps, and piping from conventional power plants. All these factors made the PWR concept appear more attainable and safer for a first-of-a-kind submarine reactor. By 1948-49, after extensive study, the Navy and AEC decided to make the pressurized water reactor the primary path for the submarine program. The first project was codenamed the Submarine Thermal Reactor, STR, later known as the S1W and S2WPWR. This decision did not eliminate the other approaches entirely. Work on the sodium-cooled reactor continued as an alternate, Submarine Intermediate Reactor, SIR, at Knowles Laboratory, and eventually led to an operational sodium-cooled plant in Seawolf. But Rickover's team placed primary emphasis on the water-cooled reactor concept for Nautilus. This choice proved wise. While Nautilus's PWR performed well, Seawolf's sodium-cooled reactor, which went to sea in 1957, suffered reliability issues. The liquid sodium system's complexity led to debilitating maintenance problems. And in 1959, the Navy removed Seawolf's sodium reactor and replaced it with a PWR similar to Nautilus's, designated S2WA. That marked the end of the liquid metal coolant experiment in U.S. subs. The simpler and more mature PWR technology had won out decisively. The PWR design pioneered for Nautilus not only became the standard for all subsequent U.S. nuclear submarines, it also was adapted into the first commercial nuclear power plant in the USS, Shippingport, operational 1957, and remains the dominant reactor type in naval and civilian use to this day.